Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Steve Petty, and I am the CEO of the Lynn Institute, and I want to thank you for taking your time to be with us. I'm going to do some really quick introductions of these amazing gentlemen that are sitting here before you. We are in the presence of greatness. I don't know if you know that, but they do. They do. Just a little bit about the Lynn Institute. We are a nonprofit organization focused on creating healthy, hopeful communities, and all of that is a part of Dr. Hellman's book, and you're going to hear a little bit about that. We began integrating hope into our work in the communities and are excited to present today's program, which is focused on faith and hope. And we're also privileged to have Dr. Hellman not only here today for this program, but as part of the work we do each and every day with the Lynn Institute in Northeast Oklahoma City, South Oklahoma City, and we're trying to expand across the state as well. For those of you who don't know Dr. Hellman, he is a nationally recognized researcher, author, and speaker, and he's a professor in the Ann and Henry Zarrow School of Social Work and founding director of the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma. He's written more than 150 scientific publications and has presented to numerous organizations, both nationally and internationally. So we're very pleased to have him here because he's traveling all the time. We're also happy to have Steve Buck, who is the CEO of Care Providers of Oklahoma, which represents the interests of more than 18,000 residents and 19,000 professionals who work in Oklahoma's long-term care facilities. And he is also on the board of the Lynn Institute, which we are very grateful to have him. As we've been offering the training using Dr. Hellman's principles and tenets related to hope, we have been consistently asked how faith and the science of hope complement each other. So that's why we're here today. We're excited to bring this program to you, so please help me introduce Dr. Chen Hellman and Mr. Steve Buck.
Well, good morning. It is an honor to be here, Dr. Hellman. It's great to spend some time with you and walking through this conversation. Probably appropriate from my perspective to do a couple of disclosures before we get rolling, right? And that's, first of all, to my knowledge, you don't hold any type of divinity degree or anything like that. I'm not trained in theological study, right? We're just a couple of, you're a scientist who's done a lot of work, and I am somebody who has had a good faith tradition throughout my life, and it's played an important role in my life. So I just want to frame that for those of you that are in our audience today. We're probably not going to work through the difference between the Greek language and maybe Hebrew. That's not on our agenda today. I don't have the capability to do that. I kind of phrase it as you and I are going to have a conversation as if we were at dinner together. And two people of faith who are going to walk through how they see the science you're doing and how that might influence the way that we practice faith in our life. Is that fair? Wonderful. Okay. I think one of the first things that I think it's important so that you'll understand the lens with which I enter this conversation. We'll offer Chan the opportunity to do the same. Is a little bit about our own faith tradition. I profess Christianity. That is my faith. I have a long history. My family was active in the faith community, and it was very much part of the rhythm of my life. So there's never really been that seeking moment for me. I remember from some of my earliest memories are Sunday morning worship, and this may give it away, Sunday morning a cappella worship. That may send a signal to some who are familiar with the Christian faith. Within our tradition, actively involved, did the youth group thing, did everything. But I would share that really the moment faith became something that you have into something you rely on, that hope thing that we're going to be weaving into our conversation today is for me really faith became more personal and not that a tradition and what you just do due to two very significant milestone events in our family's career. One of my twins had a very unexpected illness when she was 2.5, 3 years old in that window. And it was one of those moments to where nobody can tell you what's happening. We actually had to life flight her from the hospitalization here in Oklahoma City to Dallas, went through this entire process. And we face that moment, and some of you have, and it's one of those moments that you never really understand until you've actually had to live it, where the treating physician told us that you should probably prepare to tell your daughter goodbye. And it's that moment of, this isn't what family life is supposed to look like, right? I mean, she's 3 years old. How did we get to this point? And very fortunately for us, and it's kind of part of my faith story. It's not what we're going to walk through today, but very important to us is she really had what I would consider a miraculous recovery. And there's a lot of elements that played into that. And so that was really that humbling moment to where I individually can't will myself to all of this stuff, that there's this very important spirit, this very important, very, very important thread of my life that has to be tied to something greater than what we know on earth. And then second, my wife Lisa experienced breast cancer. And that was one of those moments, again, you don't expect. This stuff isn't supposed to happen. And no matter what my role, I was in government at the time, and no matter what my role was there, I couldn't will cancer away from her. And so those two moments really were the point in time where faith became more of that thread of, it's just something you do, and it's something that drives the way you live. And that happened relatively late in life for me, but very thankful for that experience. And it informs, in many ways, the part of the conversation that I'll be leading today. So now for you to share a little perspective on your faith journey.
So thank you for sharing that. That is very touching. It's hard to hear and imagine for that. And thank you to the Lynn Institute for this opportunity. And for all of you to be here. Mine is very different. And I did not grow up in the church. I did not have any of those kind of memories. Spent a little bit of time. My parents were flower children. Spent a little bit of time in a commune at a very early age. No need to go into all the detail, but during my late middle school, high school, transitioned into some time of homelessness. And just right about the beginning of all of that, some of my classmates invited me to go to Falls Creek to church camp with them. May not be surprising that the big motivating factor was there were going to be a lot of girls there. Yeah, I'll go. That was a very important experience in my life. That's when I gave my life to Christ during that week. It was such a profound emotional experience, a lot of because of what I was going through and all of that, but I made the decision at that point that I was going to read the New Testament. And I did that as an 8th grader and didn't understand a lot of it, didn't understand the versions and the deeper, rich context of that. I actually went to a couple of community ministers because I just, I profess the Christian tradition as well, and came from an a cappella background. My wife and I transitioned to the church at Battle Creek, where they use instruments, which is hard to. But I always just wrestled with, really? Did that really happen? So I would go and ask ministers in my community, it's like, how do you know? How do you know? And I was just never really satisfied with the response. And ultimately moved away from my faith in any type of practice. I was reflecting on this on my drive over, and during all of the turmoil of being homeless and all of that. And it wasn't that I stopped believing. It became more of a framework of, I'm not worthy of believing in that. And because of all the stuff that I was doing and had done. So I just sort of decided to go my own route. My wife does come from a long faith journey. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, my wife and I, she was 16, I was 18 when we got married. And next week, on March 10th, I know she's not listening because I didn't tell her that we were doing this. But just in case, we're celebrating our 36th wedding anniversary next week. So,
Now, what did you say the date was?
March 10th,
March 10th.
yes.
So uniquely, our respective families share the same anniversary date.
Is that right? Well, we're supposed to be here today, aren't we?
I think so. I mean, my wife's not listening either, so don't feel bad.
And I'll speed this up. You know, I had always just sort of pushed it aside, and then in my doctoral program, my doctoral studies, I was really ingrained into an experimental tradition, which is grounded in the fact that you have to control everything. And so just the very idea of giving up control just didn't compute with me. I fought it. And I went in and took a philosophy of science class towards the end. Went into my major professor and just, who I just adore, Dale Fuqua. And I just told him, I'm like, you know, after all this training, I just don't see how people can believe and have faith. And he gets up, shuts his office door, comes and sits down, and reintroduces me to Christ. And wow, that got kind of emotional, but that was an important moment for me. And then, you know, the hope work, it's just always been sort of to the side. I do get the question almost every presentation, what about faith and hope? And so then when this opportunity came up to have this discussion a little bit more formally, which I am just so excited and honored to be here with you in that, because I haven't figured it out. But I will tell you this, I think that those of us who are scientists in this area of hope have so much to learn about hope from the faith community. What we know, and I'll be quiet so we can talk, but one of the things that I'm just absolutely convinced on, just because of my own journey, but what I see in the research and the data and the science. When individuals experience tremendous trauma and adversity in their lives, they spend so much of their time, let me rephrase that, we spend so much of our time ruminating on the events that have happened to us, trying to figure it out, trying to understand it, trying to resolve it. And we get so wrapped up into the guilt, the shame, and regret that the future is something we're not worthy of. And I think the faith community offers, I listen to worship songs, and I listen to most of, well, I should say I listen to them, to the sermons, but most of them directly deal with that. They directly deal with, you are a child of God, and you are worthy of it. And I think that those of us doing hope work to learn from that.
You know, I should have said in my introduction, so I'll do so now, that I would ask that those of you online, those of you in person, would grant Chan and I grace from the standpoint that we may fall into a pattern of using language that is consistent with our tradition, and if that should in some way conflict with your tradition, or I hope you would grant us that grace. And also, both you and I profess Christianity, so some of our terminology, if there are people of other belief systems that are participating, and I hope you will grant us that allowance, because I think what we're speaking to today is this ability to take the science that you have spent a career investing yourself into, and to try to find some parallels between that and how people of faith find success within their faith and find comfort. And so I would just put that out as a disclosure, acknowledging that I have limited vocabulary and I have limited perspective, and I always want to be very quick to own that. Let's start with that question that comes up so much, and I will just, as an intro point to that, I found myself last night on Discovery Science Channel. There was this study about Noah's Ark. Have they found the place in Noah's Ark? And they were walking through all of this, and you had a strong professor of faith, and then you had skeptics, and they were walking through this. And it wasn't the producer's conclusion that he put out there, but it was my conclusion of, here we go. Here's this divisiveness between science and all of this stuff. As a professor of faith, I find my solace in the Lord. I mean, that's what my gravitational pull is. And your research finds this self-generated willpower and all these others. And so there's this really interesting divide between the two. I don't know that they aren't congruent, but I think sometimes we get lost in trying to find that congruence. Do you have any thoughts about how the two might intersect and they actually be complementary as opposed to contrary?
Yes. So first of all, what I'll say is that I do find them to be very complementary. I do not find them to be opposing at all. I think if there's some opposing components of it, it's a lack of clarity, it's a lack of understanding that can be easily resolved in discussion and dialogue and exploration on that. Being a professor at a university, there is a divide between the faith community. As a psychologist, faith is something we did not include in our training. Spirituality, clearly such an important part of that. So hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that we have the power to make it so, which now we might start getting into, is there some conflict here because we have the power and the will to make it so. But hope is about setting goals, finding pathways, and generating and sustaining the motivation, the agency. I use the word willpower to pursue those goals. But I think we have to take that a little bit deeper and say, what influences the goals that we value? What guides us when we begin to consider alternative pathways? What sustains us? What sustains that willpower when we experience that adversity? And for me, that's where faith enters the picture into a very complementary and probably foundational aspect of our capacity to hope. Because hope is that compass, faith is that, my faith is that compass that helps me choose which of these goals fit with my value in that tradition. And I use this term pretty intently, but which of these pathways are therefore righteous in that? And so I think about, for those individuals that I get to work with in research and otherwise, who are not necessarily able to overcome the adversities in their life, what gives them the opportunity to endure? And oftentimes I find it's their faith. Because the hope that I'm talking about is the hope of today. I was listening to just to talk about divine, that we're supposed to be here. At my church, the lead minister talked about trust and hope this weekend, which was great because I listened to it again this morning so that I could be ready for today. But he talked about it as a common hope, but the ultimate hope was the distinction. And that the adversities and the trials that I'm going through today, there is this ultimate hope that no matter what I'm going through, it will be better.
I had a chance to sit in on the last part of your training that you did this morning, and one of the statements that you made that that really stuck with me. And so a couple of disclosures. This is not the first time Shannon and I have ever sat down together. So in some ways, this is kind of like a dinner table conversation. But second, and also in disclosure, my wife does some work with Shannon in the area of health. And so she does it professionally. I do it in my role with the Lynn Institute. So this is pretty much a significant part of our rhythm. But this was the first time I've actually sat in on part of the training, was when we had the chance to do this. Everything else has been relational. And you said something that really dawned on me as a requisite to our conversation today. Or I thought that in fuel of our conversation, you talked about the fact that the more we desire the goal, the fact that we have this desire for the goal, and that stronger the desire is, then our greater opportunity for success, right? I think that was kind of the corollary you're making, but you also made a point that as practitioners, that we have to understand that this is the individual's goals. It's not a corporate goal placed upon them. If you're in the governmental social services, it's not their obligations as it relates to their juvenile justice probation or as it relates to their plan they're having to work for child welfare. We may be imposing that. At the end of the day, it has to be on their goal, right? So I'm going to tie this together for you. I also know that from other work, we understand that people's, the amount of willpower a person has is a very finite resource. And as my wife explains this to me, she speaks to a lot in the child welfare space, is when a family is working on reunification and they have a court hearing at 2, and if the mom has to worry about paying her electric bill, arranging transportation, seeing the principal because her kid's in trouble, trying to fill out 3 job applications, and trying to be care for her grandmother, she's probably going to be exhausted before she gets to that court. And it's not going to go well. And so I say all of that to frame this question, which I think is very important to me, and I really dwell on this as I had accepted the invitation to be part of this family, is those of us who are involved in evangelistic efforts, those of us that feel very strongly as part of our faith commitment that we want to be involved in and bring others to our faith community, what lessons can we learn about the amount of willpower that people may be storing up whom we are wanting to bring to a relationship with, which in our case would be a relationship with Christ? I think that there's an interesting evangelical theme we can pull from this.
Yeah, so it is true. I mean, our willpower is limited, and when that willpower is depleted, and it's being, you can also think about our willpower in the context of our ability to focus our attention on a particular pathway. So going in the courtroom and having to go through that after all of these other attention detractors are in place. When our willpower is depleted, we start to have a diminished capacity for self-regulation. So being able to sort of control our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The other thing is that individuals who are experiencing those trauma and adversity are going into those scenarios, going into that courtroom, and using your example, knowing that they're going into an adversity-laden environment, and where there's nobody, when they walk through that front door, there's nobody in the courtroom that they perceive as being on their team. And so they go into it from a context of not being able to trust. So it's going to impact our ability to relate to each other. This idea of, and some of the research that we've looked at is how those adversities influence attachment. So if I have an insecure attachment, I don't trust you, I have a difficult time communicating with you, I'm not going to get close, and those kinds of things. So one of the things, and I've actually had the privilege to do this, is to share some of this hope work with youth ministers, because what we're learning is that many of our youth in our communities are experiencing tremendous numbers of adversities, even beyond COVID and everything else that's been going on in our society. And so, if that willpower is depleted, the capacity to engage is very difficult. And so I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it's, the idea of, from that evangelical standpoint, when you start to talk to me, I'm probably fairly resistant to you in that regard. And, I don't know, I keep going back to the idea of the importance of this language in youth ministry. And understanding goals, pathways, and willpower. When that willpower is depleted, it's just very difficult to move forward.
So I'm going to connect back because you were answering the question, and I'm going to come back with a pretty pointed question relative to that. I talked earlier about my daughter's illness, and I'll just share with you that going through the trauma of what all of that looked like, one of the part of our family's testimony relative to that is after we got off the plane in Dallas and got to the hospital, there was literally, Chan, I'm not kidding, I think there were 20 to 25 people in the hallway. And we didn't know what was happening. And we got in and, finally either Lisa or I said, who were all those people? What are they here for? And the nurse said, they're here for you. And what do you mean? Well, our church youth minister had called her friend, who's a youth minister at another church in Dallas, and they wanted us loved when we got to the hospital. Now, just having them there and knowing that they could go to Walmart to get a change of clothes for us, because we came with nothing. We came from the hospital. And so there was a stressor gone. I use that to opportune this question, and I'm wondering, when I think about what you just described, within my faith construct, I wonder if this is why we were so intensively taught by Jesus to take care of the widows and the orphans, and to take care of needs, and to love others as part of bringing them into a evangelistic or a salvation conversation. How does that resonate with you?
The power of just a group of individuals, faith brothers and sisters who you didn't know, except through Christ in this particular fashion. And so, we do know that social connectedness becomes such a critical aspect of that ability to endure, that ability to sustain. And really, I was fortunate enough to have, right before COVID hit, just a breakfast meeting with Judge Pemberton, I believe, here in Oklahoma City. He was a family court judge at the time. And we were just sort of talking about hope and sort of my work in domestic violence and child maltreatment, homelessness. And he made this comment. He said, well, Chan, it's all just ministry. And I just stopped for a moment and I thought, wow, that is just the grace of the New Testament. That our ability to embrace and love on people who are suffering, that is the foundation of hope, from my perspective. So, I don't know, again.
Yeah, certainly that's what one of the thoughts I had is that there was in science, through the science you're doing, you are putting some evidence to some of the things that, at least within my tradition, I have learned. And the ability to address willpower and to build up reserves is the ability to reach the end goal. And so I was making that connection. We've touched on the science, right? You're putting the science to hope into work you're doing, which I think is just fascinating. If any of you have not taken part in any of the work or read the book, I encourage you to do so, because it is robust in what has been researched. Is it your thought that the science of hope may approach what we are comfortable with in terms of the science of traditional medicine, the availability of using what has been developed, I would say what's been developed through wisdom granted by God in order to create some of these really incredible interventions. A lot of us are very comfortable with the medical developments, but do you see hope moving in that same direction?
I do. There's some real differences, and well, there's some real perceived differences from the hard sciences to the more soft sciences that I might be associated with in the social sciences. But it turns out that our evidence, our research in science is very strong. There's over 2,000 published research studies on hope. And what's really, I think, impressive about it is that it is one of the few areas in psychology, the study of the human mind and this idea of hope. It's not contested. Those 2,000 published studies tell us the same thing, that it is one of the single best predictors of our ability to thrive. And so it provides a common language across an application in such diverse populations. And I think it's a core part of who we are, is our ability to hope for that future. So the answer is yes. I mean, the evidence and the science is there. And you know, I do believe, given the opportunity for us to have hope conversations, to explore science, that you know, and maybe this is for the group and those online, that hope is not wishing. You know, that hope is about taking action to pursue your goals, whereas wishing is a desire for an outcome with no pathways, with no strategies. So the science is good.
You know, I will admit that as we were thinking about doing this discussion, and Janine was so incredible. She poured over the Bible for us and gave us tons of quotes that we could apply in here. And I would just share observationally. I was thinking about this in preparation for this. Within the Bible, there are so many examples of God and Jesus just doing things. It is what it is. You're done. I think about on the cross and the fact that one of the other people who was crucified that day was, you will be in paradise with me after today. I mean, it was just the will. But then I think about, for example, the woman at the well, who specifically, after the conversation, his departing message is, you be blessed for your faith, sin no more. And so there was that directive action, you know, that idea that you got to practice agency, you got to work towards this goal. And I've just found this to be very, very interesting as we pull apart that. I'm sorry about that tangent. This has been a challenging presentation to prepare for. What do you think about? What do you think about the communities of faith? If you were to sit down in a consultative relationship with an elder or a minister and say, we want to become versed in hope science so that we can use it as a building block for how we are going to do our work in the community, what would that conversation look like to you?
Yeah, so I think very much when I've had this opportunity, it's just a couple of opportunities to do that. It really is being able to sit down and have a conversation about what hope is from the science perspective, this goals, pathways, willpower, and to begin to share conversations about where those connect and support, or you know, faith is and the practices are supportive of those strategies. You know, one of the verses that I've been just really sort of reflecting on, and I am by no means, I mean, you can tell me a verse, I'm like, yeah, I probably heard of it, but, you know. But you know, in Romans, and it's chapter 5, and I think it's verse 3 and 4. You know, I usually will make a comment in my presentations, you know, that in order to nurture hope, children need to have some adversity in their life, and that particular chapter and a couple of verses deal with, you know, adversity builds perspective. I can't, you know, quote it obviously, but perseverance builds character, and character leads to hope. And I just think, wow, I mean, that just sort of explains the last 15 years of my work in trauma and adversity, and you know, how we've learned to find meaning and purpose in our journey. And so I do think that the language of hope can be a real sort of overall framework and common language that can help in, the faith community's ministry out in the community. My work in particular in the context of trauma and adversity, where we do want to go into these, communities where folks are really struggling and have a lot of adversity, from a lot of different angles, is to understand where that's coming from and why churches, church members in the faith of hope for our communities, right? They have these goals of ministry out in engaging with individuals and showing children of God and worthy of this future. And that's what we're studying. And so I think the science can be very complementary in saying to the faith community, there's a whole body, a robust body of evidence to support what you're doing already through this language of hope.
I appreciate that. I think we're about to our wrap up of our dinner conversation, and I think dessert will be the questions that come from the field, right? One final observation, and this was no rocket science moment, but as I thought about this, I kept reflecting on this is oversimplified, so I own that this is an oversimplified statement, but whoever believeth and is baptized shall be saved. You have a goal in salvation. You have a pathway, right, in the baptism, and you have willpower and belief.
Right, absolutely.
So
well said.
that was one segment that caught my attention of, hey, I can apply this, right? Okay, so I hope we've done an adequate job. Thank you for your patience. I think we've got about 15 minutes that you've allocated for Q&A. If there is any questions and answers, and again, if there's anything overly technical, we're going to refer to somebody else, right? I don't want to speak out of my scope, so. My microphone's coming for you.
Thank you. If you're talking to someone that does not have a faith background and you're trying to nurture hope in them, someone with a faith background has their faith in God that they are confident in. But if you're trying to nurture someone without that hope, where are they getting the power to find hope themselves if they don't have it, if they don't feel that they have it within them?
So, I'll just speak from my own experience with that because of leaving moving away from the faith community. And, one of the true blessings in my life is that my skepticism, my wrestling with it, didn't change their love for me. It didn't change the way in which they were going to walk down that journey with me. And so part of that is, just the authentic connection with another human being who's suffering and walking with them. So it's modeling hope, I think. That to me seems pretty profound. This is going to seem kind of silly, but it stands out for me. And I just love the Stephen King book, The Stand, which is this good and evil, God versus the devil story. And there's one part of it where two of the main characters, this is not a spoiler alert, but Mother Abigail is talking, and she is the sort of the representative of God and good. And one of the main characters discloses to her that that he's an atheist, that he doesn't believe in God. And she just laughed and laughed, and she says, "Well, that's okay, Nick, because he believes in you." And that was such a profound statement for me when I read that. And I think that's what's guiding the journey.
I would add to that observation, and this is a career faith blend over, and it goes back to this concept of willpower and the demands on people. A family that is going through the unexpected death of a child from SIDS, for example, at that moment, they've got to be calmed. They've got to be loved. The conversation about relationship with God comes after they've been calmed. Because at that moment, that is, every single bit of energy is consumed by this extremely painful experience. And so I think your example is right on, but it's my own personal conviction that we have to meet people where they're at physically to calm them in order for them to develop that willpower, to develop that relationship that we desire.
You say those things so well, by the way. You're very, very articulate. I really appreciate
We're
that.
not paying an extra for that.
No, I just honestly, I really appreciate that.
Okay, so similarly to that, kind of a lead off of that, the question I have is I often hear particularly preachers and people of faith kind of talk about the hope and the hope we have in Christ. And I see sort of the background side of going, we have to, at least my perspective has been like, we kind of have to look at and identify some of the things you were talking about, like the situations that led to some of the beliefs. And so I feel like there's people on either side of the fence, like I'm only going to look at the bad or I'm only going to look at the good. And like, how do you help people navigate like identifying or recognizing what is true, but also being willing to walk through to get to hope? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure yet. I'm really worried that I didn't understand the question. Can you help me with that again?
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of times in like the Christian, specifically Christian world, we have this idea that we want to talk to people just about like, God is good, he has hope, there's restoration, there's redemption, all of these great, beautiful things. And sometimes we miss in that going, yes, this thing happened, and yes, this is hard, and we're going to recognize that, but we're not going to stay there, I guess. So, I don't know, just kind of how do you, it's not a super direct question.
So how do you kind of bridge that component? So I'm going to actually, I was actually thinking about this on the way over. One of the things that, and I'm a very cognitive believer, and my wife is, cognitive as well, but she's a very emotional. I mean, her belief and faith is deep and rich and very, and for me, it's just much more sort of cognitive in that. And one of the things that Alex, our minister, shared one time that I just really appreciated is that people who, and I tend to put myself in that category of that adversity and kind of struggling with it. And when I walk into a church, symbolically walk into a church, and I see this ladder of faith, right? The journey that people are on, but I see everybody at the top of the ladder. I don't see how you get there. I don't see the connection between my adversity, where I'm at, my struggling, my wrestling, because all I see is everybody who's all this, this emotional, it's just, they're just in it. And he talked about the fact that we need to show that we have, we're on this first run too. We need to be authentic and that, each and every day. And one of the in my acapella first, when I really made that cognitive decision that this is where I'm at, our minister at the time did sermon on gifts. And so I thought, all right. I sent an email. I said, I know what my gift is. I'm a really good researcher. I'm really good at that. And which wasn't necessarily in line with what he was talking about. And he reached back out. He said, let's go for coffee. And so anyway, we're sitting at a table, and I lean over and I'm like, all right, come on. When did you really decide that resurrection thing really happened? And he leaned back over to the table looking at me, and here's what he says: I'm still wrestling with it every day. And for me, that was that first rung. And he showed me that they're not up here. And then there needs to be that authentic connection that we're all struggling. So, but faith offers a community of love and support and remembering that we're children of God and we're worthy of that future of what can be good.
You know, I'm gonna build upon that. Again, I talked earlier about my faith tradition, and within the community of worship I had, I remember, and we kind of stepped away from this, but I remember the invitation song, and you went down at the end of the preaching, and you either went down for baptism or prayers or confession. And I think about how we are to confess. And I mean, this is where I'm at in my relationship with God. Is He knows when I've confessed a sin. That's between He and I. He knows those thoughts. But I think that there is merit in confession and discussion in that encourages other believers. That if somebody in who everybody thinks the world is going great stands up and says, man, I'm struggling with porn. It's eating me alive. Man, that changes the dynamic. And for those of you that weren't in the pre-training, I think it was this table who asked about mental health. Think about where we were 2 decades ago in our conversations about mental health. I at the time worked for a mental health advocacy organization, and that really was my first footprint job. And I would often speak about how many times have you gone and looked at a church bulletin, and there's Sally, let's pray for her for cancer, and Bill lost his mother this week, let's pray for him. Did you ever see Paul's son is struggling with schizophrenia? It was viewed as a weakness, a character flaw. But because people have started talking about their experience as it relates to mental health, mental illness, addiction, I think that's changing all of our ability to have meaningful, need-centered, loving conversations about those. So I really appreciate that question a lot. I think the way we bridge that gap is for us to be communicative in the standpoint that we all struggle, we all have victories, we all have valleys.
I just had a comment. There's a really interesting event that happens the week right before Jesus is crucified, where he's posed a question by a religious political group known as the Sadducees. And his response to them is, no, you're mistaken because you don't know the scriptures, nor do you know the power of God. And I think it kind of speaks to your dichotomy, Chan, between you and your wife, where you probably come at this from the scripture side of it. She comes from the power of God or more of the experiential, and it takes really both. I think about the woman at the well that you mentioned earlier. He said, you've got to worship in spirit and in truth. There's always a balance. And the number 2 in the Bible is the spirit as the number of witness. So, thank you. Great presentation, by the way.
So we've been talking about in navigator training, goals, pathways, and willpower. And in many circumstances, we can walk in and let's talk about goals, pathways, and willpower. But in many situations, that would be a complete turnoff, especially in some of the ministry areas of a church. So how do we get to goals, pathways, and willpower without it being an in-your-face kind of procedural kind of thing? What do we do with that? Is that about relationship or questions or getting to know someone more? How can that be part of the ministries that some of the people here today are involved in?
I think that's this is how I fall back on this. And if this is too academic of an explanation, I'm open to a conversation about There are some of you who are here today and listening either online or in person who really wishes that Chan and I had prepared a PowerPoint that you could take home and study because you are a reading learner. That's how you learn. There are others up here who really wish you had closed off the video because my shirt is too distracting, and you just wish you could have heard the audio because you're audio learners. And there are others in the room who need it all. You need to take in every single bit of sensory stimulation you can get. We all learn and we're all brought to pathways differently. And so Janina, I think it takes a understanding of that fact that you just can't scream from the pulpit every Sunday that this is the only way. That if you're doing that in the absence of going and loving people, and if you're doing that in the absence of really engaging people in deep theological study, you're not catching everybody because we all learn differently and we have to realize that.
One of the things that when we teach the goals, pathways, willpower process, and we very intentionally set goals, right? We start there and then we start to look for the steps and pathways of that. For me, I think it's much more about experiencing that process as a Hope Navigator in that specific training, but to be able to step back, from a much broader view and say, how do I live that process in my life? That's not a worksheet, right? That is trying to understand and listen to and give space to what are the goals that individuals have in the pathways, modeling it in those strategies. But, we never just go up and say, you just need to be hopeful today. So let's set a goal and pathway for a time. So, I like your response.
This has all been amazing. Thank you so much. I'm trying to formulate my question to where it makes sense, so forgive me as I'm still am talking it out. But when I think of the church, oh, I'm so sorry. Robert Moore is coming on. When I think of the church, I think of how, and because I'm African American, I have to see things from the lens of my people and other people groups and how it impacts them and everything that we talk about. And unfortunately, Sunday is the most segregated day of the week. And so when I think of faith and Christ and all of these things that we deal with, I think of that. And so bridging that to hope, I'm just curious about the research as it relates to the different people groups and maybe, you mentioned the ladder, so it makes me think, are there different levels that you've discovered or determined or learned about that different people groups have and as it relates to hope? So I don't know how I bridge the segregation part and the hope, but I'm just thinking, are there different people or different levels in people groups when it comes to hope?
Are you asking about sort of just cultural differences?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. So I've actually had the opportunity to be engaged in some research that allows us to begin to look at that. And you'll have to forgive me because my work as a researcher is just in trauma and adversity and in that realm. But I'm part of a U.S. Department of Justice research grant looking at this thing called poly-victimization, and it's the idea that people experience adversities across the lifespan. During childhood, there are adversities, during young adulthood and later adulthood. And this year, we did include, systemic oppression, historical trauma as part of that. And as a team and a group, this summer, afforded us an opportunity to say, we think racism needs to be one of those things that we begin to examine. And we're ultimately looking how it impacts hope in that regard. So I am involved in some research, but from an adversity perspective. And what I suspect, and I would love the conversation and the push back and forth because it's a learning opportunity for me. Hope is about goals, pathways, and willpower, and I think that transcends. But it's very clear that these issues that I talked about, whether it's systemic issues, historic trauma, racism, are significant barriers to pathways. I think that where these differences come into is I have to recognize that as a professor at the University of Oklahoma, I have access to resources that are very different than other members of my neighbors. And so it allows me access to resources and pathways that my neighbors may not experience. I think that's where it's at. I don't, when, transitioning that into we were fortunate enough to go spend a significant amount of time with our neighbors. I'm from Tulsa, so we were able to go to North Tulsa to celebrate the life of my neighbor's sister. And I will tell you, the funerals that I'm used to going to last about 30 minutes. There may or may not be a call, the short chance. And then we'll go, to break bread and not talk about things. 3.5 hours later at my neighbor's sister's funeral, it was a celebration. And that was really an honor to be able to experience that. That's my thoughts. I don't know.
And I would say I'm glad you challenged us with this question, because that should be on all of our minds.
Okay, I'm gonna ask this question because it was given to me, it's not my question. But, is it that in the Bible, we have scripture that we call upon in times when we need to build hope? If we follow the tenet that hope can be taught, then how do the two things that come from the science of hope that we've been taught, so we can pull from the inside, and we can also pull scripture from the Bible and from inside, how do you see that complemented?
Okay. Sometimes I feel like we should put these over by the door. So hit the road. I will tell you that when I had an opportunity to spend 4 hours on the road in preparation for a very adverse interaction with my father, without really realizing it, I'm getting close to the Texas border. And I just had this mantra growing through my head because I was so upset, so anxious, did not want to be where I was going. And what I realized was that I just had this constant mantra in my head: trust in the Lord, trust in the Lord, trust in the Lord. And, I think that, that trust is the foundation of hope, to be honest with you, that the future can be better. And I think that those scriptures, if we're drawn to those, is that reassurance and that source of endurance, that source of replenishing or restoring. I think that the New Testament is full of hope modeling pathways, of how we can and should do things. So that would be sort of my.
Yeah, I would just respond that the scriptures were offered and inspired for the purpose of being written so that generations down the road would all still have that as a resource. And so I would think it's a very complementary context that intentionality in our DNA, we have the written word for the specific reason to give us the willpower and the pathway. And so I think they're very complementary in nature. There are people who, because of their belief structure or wherever they're at, that are certainly drawing upon their own reserves. I understand that. But I think the speaking of scripture and the written of scripture was to give us that little boost to understand that there's a pathway out there that can really inform us to a unparalleled level of hope.
Any other questions?
I would also say that just from what you just said, I mean, the other thing is that if I'm absent of that, then, you know, I'm going through that moment in time alone. Whereas when I'm reflecting on culture or my faith, caught up in that question. It is my connectedness with something greater than myself, right? Which hope is. You know, we're connected to something, and so I'm not alone. I'm not alone in this journey. And you know, I may not be connected to an individual here that I can refer to, but I certainly have that deep, rich connection that is so important for hope.
Let's give Dr. Hellman and Mr. Buck a round of applause. Thank you, gentlemen. That was great. I really appreciate it. Just to let you know, this will